Well, as we begin our time, reflect. All God's doing. That's inspiration. That means in spirit. So there you go. Well, as we begin our time of reflection today, I want you to take a couple minutes and think about a time in your life when you knew for certain you were loved. Were you by yourself? Were you with somebody? If you were with somebody, who were you with? But most importantly, I want you to think about, how did it feel? How did it feel to have that moment, often too fleeting, but how did it feel to have that sense, even for a brief moment, that you were loved and cherished? Our passage today talks about a time in the life of Jesus, the second time in actuality, in which Jesus heard the voice of God and heard God call him the beloved. "This is my son," the voice from heaven said, "the beloved, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." Now, it's striking that this incident should happen twice in the life of Jesus, and I have a feeling part of that has to do with how desperately we as human beings need to hear that. Because the intent of this story, as is true in much of the life of Jesus, is the intent is that we put ourselves in that story, that the story is not just telling us some past event that happened to Jesus in his incarnate life, but the idea is we take that notion over into our lives. That there is a sense, too, in which we are invited into transformation, into change. And the only reason that is possible is because we are grounded in the reality that we, each and every one of us, is God's beloved. As God's sons and daughters, we are the beloved in whom God is well pleased. And it's such a striking event in the life of Jesus that this voice should come twice in his life. First was, of course, at the baptism of Jesus, which we talked about in January. And now we have this critical event, another critical event in the life of Jesus. This event, like the first, the baptism, is so very important that it shows up in all three of the synoptic gospels. It's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And is as often true, even though the same incident or same story shows up again, there's always just a little bit of a difference. And in reading each of the ways the gospel writers talks about it, kind of reveals new stuff for us as we reflect on this incident in his life. And so although they all record the same event, each of them does it a little bit differently. And if you go back later and read the passage from Matthew 17, you'll notice one of the things that's really unique about Matthew is it begins a few days later, the passage says. A few days later, Jesus took the disciples with him up the mountain. Now again, like Jenny said, you kind of think, wow, they must have been the special ones, because only 3 of them get to go. And of course, it leaves you wondering, well, a few days after what? Why would the author start with a phrase like that? Well, Anna Owens, a pastor in Kansas, in her reflections for Presbyterian Outlook, comments that that's actually a very important phrase. Because we have to think about, it actually says 6 days later. It's very specific. 6 days later, Jesus takes the disciples up the mountain. So that begs the question, well, what happened 6 days ago? So you got to go back to the previous chapter, chapter 16. And what happens are 2 very critical things. One is Peter's confession that Jesus is the Messiah. A very critical confession. And again, it's that confession which prepares the disciples for this moment on the mountaintop. And then Jesus begins telling them about what it means that he is the Messiah. He's not the Messiah like they've all thought the Messiah would be. He's not going to be some regal character, somebody with lots of power and fame and influence. Instead, Jesus is the Messiah, the suffering servant that they know about from the passages in the prophet Isaiah. And only with that foundation, with that very foundation that Jesus is the true Messiah, and that to be the Messiah is to be a suffering servant, to live as a human being, to be crucified and to die and to rise again, all of that is critical to what happens on that mountaintop. Because now the teaching of Jesus is going to kind of change and mutate after this critical event. Because now Jesus has laid the foundation for being the Messiah and what that really means. And now he will live out that reality, and he will be teaching them more and more about how the Messiah will suffer and die and rise again. So this passage is critical. Again, it's in all three of the Synoptic Gospels, and it becomes the foundation of our church with a capital C and of our lives as Christians. And so we have this critical passage. 6 days later, Jesus takes 3 of his beloved disciples up the mountain, and of course, the scenery is meant to be important as well. That throughout Scripture, the idea of the mountaintop experience, we get that phrase from these stories. The idea that going up the mountain, which is kind of amusing if you've ever been in the Middle East, because, their mountains aren't like the Swiss Alps. Their mountains aren't like the Rockies. They're not these huge, giant mountains. But, it's a rise in the earth. It's a little bit higher than the rest. And the idea is that when we go up the mountain, it's a time of exhilaration. Something new and different happens to us. We are somehow changed by that experience. And then we come back down the mountain to real life. And so the story is meant to emulate the time when Moses comes before the presence of God and is transformed. Now Moses' life completely changes. He's no longer simply a shepherd out tending his father-in-law's sheep. He becomes now the voice of God for the people, the presence that leads them out of slavery into freedom. But to take them into that freedom, they have to go through the wilderness, and that is the very journey we will begin on Wednesday. That days of 40 days when we will spend our time coming through the wilderness, coming off the high mountain, going through the desert lands until we get to the resurrection. And so it's very purposely laid out. The author of this story wants to point out that just like Moses met God on the mountain, now too they meet the true Messiah on the mountain of God. And so we are meant to see that scenery, to think back to that old story, and to come again to its revisioning here. So what does it mean for them to come together on this mountain and then once again to hear this voice of God say, "This is my Son, the beloved"? It's a powerful voice that obviously God thinks that not only does Jesus need to hear it again, but so did the disciples. And interestingly enough, this time we get the disciples' reaction. We don't find out at his baptism what they thought of that whole unfolding voice from heaven stuff. But we know when they hear that voice on the mountain, they are afraid. They're terrified. They fall down in homage at Jesus' feet. And having seen as Jenny so well pointed out, the symbol of the law with Moses and the symbol of prophecy with Elijah, standing there talking to Jesus, and then they disappear and God's voice comes, and then everything goes back, supposedly, to the way it was. So what does it mean for us to say and to hear the voice of God call us a son or a daughter and call us God's beloved? One of my favorite authors, Henri Nouwen, who died a number of years ago, was a priest, a Roman Catholic priest that his ministry encompassed a lot of different things. But one of his greatest ministries, in my opinion, was his writing. He wrote a lot of books about all kinds of different subjects. And what I always liked about Henri is that he made things accessible. You could understand it. You could figure out what he was talking about. And one of my favorite books is called Life of the Beloved. And in that book, he points out again that the idea is as we hear those words addressed to Jesus, that they are intended for us as well. And so he is writing this book to a friend named Fred, and he's talking about what does it mean to be God's beloved. And he says one of the ways we know that is through the enactment of the Lord's Supper, of the Eucharist, as they call it in the Roman Catholic tradition. And that there are 4 parts to that process. It's that the bread is taken, that it's blessed, that it's broken, that it's given. And so he says if we look at each component, and we have that in our own communion process, it's not quite as clearly delineated and laid out into those 4 steps, but all 4 of those steps are part of our communion process as well. And so first, the bread is taken, which means that the bread has been chosen, and that the idea is that we are taken and chosen, each and every one of us, by God. And then the next step is that the priest will lift up the host and bless it. And it seems to me that's one of the most powerful components of that whole process, because it seems like we live in a world that's really quick to give us words of curse. I mean, I'm always shocked at when I listen to TV sometimes, and I'm really terrible at keeping up with my Facebook page. But they'll talk about the things people will say, and then all the rude things that get said about it. And I'm just amazed. I'm like, do they know other people are going to read that stuff? I mean, their like name and their pictures attached to it. Do they know that people are going to read the rude things they just said about somebody else? I don't know, but they just say it anyway. So it seems like there's just so many voices out there that want to tell us we are nothing special, we are not important to anybody, we don't matter, and that we're even here is just insignificant. But God's voice says the total opposite. And in that blessing, we are given words of blessing that tell us we do matter, that we're created by God, that we're loved by God, that we've been chosen by God. And that alone makes us special. And so we get words of blessing. And then perhaps the most challenging part is then the host is then broken. And we do that as we prepare for communion, as I usually stand back here at the table and I'll break the bread. It's the idea that we are broken open before God, that we are able to be our true selves. We don't have to hide anything. I think that our 12-step programs sometimes do the best job at talking about what it means to come into a group, to know that we're broken. Everyone in that room is broken in some way or another. And that it's by allowing ourselves, we can do a couple things with that awareness of being broken. We can lament it, which doesn't really get us anywhere, or we can kind of embrace it and learn from what our brokenness teaches us, and learn and grow and realize that sometimes in that very brokenness, our calling comes out. And then finally, we are given. We are given, just as the bread is given in communion, Jesus was given for us, each and every one of us is given as well. And what a radical notion if we, each of us, thought, first of all, about ourselves in that way. How might that change the world in which we lived? Is if every one of us could recognize that we are chosen, created, uniquely loved by God, every single one of us. And how might that change the interactions we have with other people, maybe other people in our family, our neighborhood, our church, if we recognize that each of us is chosen, blessed, given, but so is everybody else. Then maybe we wouldn't spend so much time worrying about illegal aliens. Every time I hear that phrase, illegal aliens, I guess I'm too much of a sci-fi geek. I think about aliens coming from space somewhere. I always forget they mean people. I don't like that. They're not illegal aliens. They're usually legal, but they're in a whole host of different expressions of that. But what would our world be like instead is if we looked at other people as God's beloved as well? And then how would that realization for ourselves and for others transform our churches and transform our neighborhoods and transform our nation? And so as we listen to this story of the Transfiguration, we are invited to place ourselves in that story as well. To hear the words that come to Jesus and say, "This is my Son, the beloved, in whom I am well pleased." Listen to him. So what if we were able to embrace the fact that we are chosen by God, that we are blessed, and in that way able to be a blessing to others? That we are broken just as human beings. There's some part in us somewhere that's still a little broken. But ultimately that we are given in love to be that love for other people. Perhaps it is the best message we could hear over Valentine's weekend, that the love that we talk about isn't just romantic love, but that what if we took the idea of the love we express on Valentine's Day to be for ourselves and to be for others as well? May we embrace the words of God as Jesus did. May we acknowledge that we are God's sons and daughters. We are the beloved, in whom God is well pleased. So may we be that love for ourselves and one another. Amen.